Colleagues, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to join this panel on crisis in Pakistan. I'm Dr. Sue Onslow. It's my great pleasure to be chair and moderator of this discussion today on the critical events which are taking place in Pakistan at the moment, but of course, which have a long history. The panel discussion is part of a series of events we are organizing here at the Institute to assess political and economic crises confronted by countries within the Commonwealth. We've had an excellent discussion on crisis in Sri Lanka, and next spring we will be addressing the challenges that confront Nigeria and also South Africa. Of course, I'm afraid, as you are all too familiar, Pakistan at 75 since independence faces multiple crises. The challenge to the state to handle a divided society, extreme political polarization, and a fractured and very stressed economy with particular social distress, which has been exacerbated by the catastrophic floods of earlier this year. The ouster, of course, of Prime Minister Imran Khan in April of 2022 has proved to be an ongoing political crisis throughout the summer and into the autumn. And we welcome your insights and your contribution to the understanding of the debate and your assessment of how these crises may play out. In terms of the order of speakers, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Najam Sethi, editor of the Friday Times, Professor Mohammed Wasim, Professor of Political Science at Lahore University of Management Sciences, who is also the author of Political Conflict in Pakistan by Hearst Publishers, which gives a detailed account of why the country historically come to these systemic crises. The third speaker will be Justice Nazira Iqbal, former judge at the Lahore High Court, and our fourth speaker, Ms. Sahar Bandial, women's rights lawyer and a member of the Mohammed Law Associates. So if I may invite, please, Mr. Najam Sethi to make his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Sue. It's a pleasure being on this panel. And I will stick to the 10 minutes given to me to try and explain what's happening in Pakistan right now. As you said, at 75, Pakistan turned 75 a few months ago, and we are beset with a lot of crises. But, you know, the notion of Pakistan in crisis is not new. We keep talking about the myriad crises that Pakistan faces: crisis of state, crisis of society, crisis of the economy, crisis of foreign policy, and so on and so forth. But something interesting has been happening, which is quite unprecedented in many ways since 2011, 2012. That's when the military establishment decided that they'd had enough of the two dynastic parties led by the Bhutto Zardaris and the Sharifs. And they needed a different outlook on the country. They'd run into trouble with both the dynasties, which had begun to challenge them from time to time, and that occasionally led to insecurity and instability. So they chanced on Imran Khan. Imran had been in politics for many, many years, but had never made a dent of any sorts. But in 2011, 2012, by in terms of Prime Minister, and to create a hybrid system that would serve them well. They'd stay behind the scenes, they'd have a charismatic cultish figure at the top, and they would try and eliminate the consensus behind the two leading political parties and dynasties. So Imran Khan was launched. At that time, Zardari's government was in power. He survived. But in 2018, in the elections in 2018, Imran was helped to win that election. Now that is an old story. I won't go into that, but a lot of rigging took place to make sure that he got in. But he didn't get such a majority that he could rule uninterruptedly without threats from the opposition that ended up ganging up against him. So for 4 years, almost 4 years, Imran ruled like a an autocratic sort of ruler, but with the help of the military, which continued to prop him up. The experiment in the end failed for a couple of reasons. One was that Imran didn't deliver the promise of reforming the economy, the promise of mending fences and relations with the foreign powers, especially the United States. And in the meanwhile, the army continued to get discredited for the failings of the Imran Khan regime. And until a time came when the military establishment decided that they needed to distance themselves from Imran Khan because they were now being discredited with a lot of things. Corruption began to raise its ugly head in Punjab. Imran did nothing about it. Imran couldn't set the economy right. During Imran's time, our foreign relations with the Saudi Arabians and with the Chinese and with the Americans deteriorated, and so on. This compelled the military to go back to the drawing board and see what they could do now that they were being discredited. And I think the conclusion they came to was, let's step back, let's become neutral or apolitical, as they now call it. But the minute that happened, the message that was sent across to the opposition that had ganged up against Imran was that, okay, now you can take him on, we are not going to bail him out. And to cut a long story short, eventually the opposition was able to put together a vote of no confidence against him, by hook and by crook, but all by a constitutional means. And Imran was faced with a very serious threat of being overthrown in parliament. Imran had turned to the military at that time and asked the military to bail him out. The military said, no, we're not going to do that. And I think thereby hangs this tale of eventually the opposition succeeded in ousting Imran Khan and coming into government. Since at that time, there was a demand that there should be fresh elections. There was only a year and some months, or maybe nearly a year and a half to go for the next elections. And it was felt that now was a good time to have a new round of elections so that the people could choose who they wanted to vote for or stay in power for the next 5 years. The combined opposition parties that were under the banner of the Pakistan Democratic Movement decided to stay on and cling on to power, which I think was a mistake because they ended up having to then sign on the dotted line with the IMF to stave financial default. And that ended up leading them to take very unpopular economic decisions that imposed enormous hardships on the people. So overnight, from being a very popular, in a very popular situation, they ended up becoming unpopular. And Imran Khan, whose track record of 4 years was quite abysmal and was quite unpopular by the time he was knocked out, suddenly began to reacquire, in a sense, he got a new rebirth or a birth in life. And since then, it's been uphill for Imran and downhill for the government. And the army finds itself stranded somewhere in between. Imran is now threatening to overthrow the government. He wants a new election date, and he wants to appoint the next army chief. The current army chief retires in this month, 29th of this month. Imran thinks that if the opposition are able to appoint their own man as army chief, his chances of returning to power might be slim. And so he's very keen that they should not have a free hand in doing this. Mm-hmm. He also wants a quick election because he says, or he thinks that he can't wait for another 8 or 9 months when the next elections are due, because he thinks he's at the peak of his popularity now, and he thinks that he can only go downhill. And the narrative that he spun together, which is a mixture of anti-Americanism, religious rhetoric, the rhetoric of corruption, the slogans against the corruption of the ancien regimes, and the fact that this new generation of Pakistanis, young people, most of them, at least 50% of them under the age of 35, with little sense of history. The only notion they have is that the Zardaris and Bhuttos are corrupt and Imran Khan is Mr. Clean. He thinks that over time, he may lose some of their support because his own machinations and his corruptions or his incompetences might become exposed. So there is now a tussle going on right now, and we are in that very critical month of November, when there is going to be a change in the army high command. The existing government wants to appoint the next army chief. Imran doesn't like that. He's threatening a long march. He's actually launched his long march. And he's trying to pressurize the army to put a gun to the head of the existing government and tell them to go home and call fresh elections. And the army's position right now is that they want to stay neutral. They want to stay out of this. They think they've had their hand bitten off by their constant interventions in politics, the last one being a disaster. And they've lost faith in Imran Khan as the savior or somebody who's going to give them the salvation that they were looking for. The hybrid regime they propped up is no more, is discredited. The government that is in power right now isn't very popular. And Imran Khan is thundering and knocking on the doors of coming back to power. He is now threatening a long march. He's on his way to Islamabad. He thinks he can put together tens of thousands, perhaps even 100,000 more people. And the fear is that this long march could turn violent because the situation is very precipitous. And if that happens, then all bets are off. Will the army stand by and allow the economy to sink again into political chaos and economic uncertainty? Or will they step in to pry apart the two warring sides? Or what will they do? Will the government throw in the towel and say, okay, we'll go for fresh elections? Or will they dig their heels in and say, no, we're not going anywhere? So we're headed into a very difficult month this year. And frankly, Imran is going to try his best, in a sense, to get the army to intervene on his side. His narrative is built on one fundamental fact that he thinks is a fact. He wants the army to be on his side. It's not a question of Imran Khan versus the army establishment or the army's role in politics. His view is this, that he is good, the opposition is evil. This is a match between good and evil. And he thinks the state, the organs of the state, the judiciary and the army should stand with good. And he thinks that there's no question of being neutral or apolitical. So he wants an army intervention, but on his side. What sort of army intervention, one doesn't really know, because if there were to be a real army intervention, then all sides would lose. But those conditions are going to be difficult all around for an army intervention to take place the way it used to in the old days, i.e. a martial law. So there are lots of questions hanging in the air and lots of queries, and of course, a great deal of apprehension and tension currently, including in business circles who are afraid that the IMF program could be derailed by all this political instability and uncertainty. And if that happens, then of course, we might face financial default. There are constant references to what happened in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And so we're all sitting on the edge, wondering what's going to happen in the next two or 3 weeks.
Mr. Sethi, thank you very much indeed for such an eloquent and concise presentation of the current tinderbox, which is Pakistan at this very point. If I may now ask Professor Mohammed Wasim to make his remarks of the political constituencies supporting various factions and various elements of the state and the army.
Hey, it's a great pleasure to be here as a speaker. There is the crisis, but the crisis has been the buzzword about Pakistan in scholarship and the media for decades. There is, of course, the economic crisis, which has been outlined by Nadim Sethi, my friend. There is borrowing for survival, and he has referred to Sri Lanka as a model. Of course, the environmental crisis, where you've got global climate change and floods in Pakistan clamoring for help. And there is, of course, political crisis, which is where my limited expertise lies. So here, my contention is that there is no viable conflict resolution mechanism in Pakistan. This is the real problem. For example, Parliament is unable to disengage people from the street and engage them and their representatives in a process of bargaining on the floor of the House. Similarly, constitutionalism would provide congenial spaces for articulating conflictual demands, but not in Pakistan. So what has happened? Demonization of the political class for the last 60 years from Ayub Khan onwards. So here there is a clash of institutions as a permanent feature of Pakistani politics. There is civil versus military, parliament versus judiciary, judiciary versus executive, and other patterns of conflict. Enter Imran Khan 2018, the hatchet man of the establishment. And here is what is called the creation of the mosaic myth. Here is the leader who takes the nation to the promised land. For the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, this mosaic myth has worked here and there. And Imran adopted the strategy of polarizing the nation through binaries, good and bad, corrupt and clean, dynastic leadership and the middle class, friends and foes, traitors and patriots. So this way, he started to rule from outside the parliament. In one single day, for example, 52 presidential ordinances were issued. So where is the parliament? Exit Imran Khan 2022. Down, but not out. He's asking the neutrals not to stay neutral, as it has been explained. So that means that street mobilization continues in pursuit of elections as the core issue at this moment, November 2022. Imran Khan's support base, there is and was and has been a support base. We should talk about it. For example, the middle class, which has in a way been the rival political center of the political class. And of course, there is the strategic asset which he has had, which is the expatriate Pakistanis. And of course, he has a narrative building exercise through an explosive social media. So, as opposed to all this, in Shehbaz Sharif, there is a paucity of narrative. There is a weak coalition of multiple parties, nothing to deliver. So establishment is very much in doldrums. Imran in and Imran out. Imran in means the specter of bad governance. Imran out means that there is an arch mobilizer out in the street. So for the moment, there is a damage control strategy till elections, which can be happened between March and October 2023. Now, in all this, where is foreign policy? In an inward-looking nation steeped in conflict, as I've said, between civil military, government opposition, center province, all these conflicts, where is foreign policy? International relations have been conducted without diplomacy. South Asia has become a region without regionalism. And here, what next? Is past the future? That is the whole issue here. There is a quest for a silver lining, of course, and that can be that Saudi Arabia and China bail Pakistan out. There can be some kind of a damage control as far as climate change is concerned. For example, putting in the state's resources and of course the resources from outside to damage the floods, damage the whatever has happened because of the floods. And of course, there can still be a consensus on the election date when politicians belonging to PPP, PTI, and PMLN and other parties emerges, because it is still possible. If establishment gives a clear idea that we are no more there as a political player, you decide by yourself, then obviously Imran's total reliance on the establishment will go, and probably that will be a kind of a damage control when there is a political class, politicians themselves, when they come to some kind of an understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Wasim, for those very cogent remarks, talking, as you say, about this mosaic mix and the extent to which the power of the binary narrative in mobilizing the politics of the street rather than constitutional politics and norms and forms, which is proving so dangerous and so toxic in Pakistan's case. If I may now invite Justice Nazira Iqbal, please, to make your remarks. Where is the Pakistani judiciary in this particular complex, fraught situation in Pakistan today?
So I think she's now getting...
Well, yes.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
Well, as you know, we have a federal system, and the other thing that we have a written and a rigid constitution, and we have three pillars of the state: the legislature, which makes the law according to the constitution, and then we have the executive, which administers the law, and we have the judiciary to keep them both within their bounds and to ensure that everything in the republic takes place within the limits of law. And I think that the judiciary has role very and obviously judiciary also has to face many challenges. I think taken on more public interest situations also, which is necessary to ensure that everything in the country is according to law. And given the kind of crisis that we have to go through, you know, these days we have a very serious crisis of governance, as well as the situation that we have had this terrible deluge, natural disaster, which has put about 1/3 of the country underwater. And these people who are homeless and they have no shelter, no clothing. And of course, this is not the responsibility of the judiciary, but the judiciary has to harness the other forces of governance to ensure that they don't really rule. They are actually governing in the manner that the Constitution empowers them to do. Can you hear me?
We can. I think it's wise if you turn it off. The bandwidth may increase if you turn your image off, Justice.
So I really didn't have too much to say because, you know, I have been away from the judiciary for the past 20 years. We retired at the age of 62, which I think is a very advisable thing in the kind of climatic conditions we have, that people really keep their wits about them and their general faculties until a certain age. And in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, we have the age of 65, after which everybody retires, which is probably not the practice in countries where there's better climatic conditions and people have longer lifestyles and living accommodations also. And of course, we are lucky that in Pakistan, the judiciary has now, for the first time since Benazir Bhutto's time, been initiated in the superior judiciary, 5 justices in the 3 major courts of the 3 provinces, and in the 4th High Court, we had for the first time a woman Chief Justice in Balochistan, which was considered to be the place where we had the least female advocates who had had less chance to go to law school, and law schools were not open to women, as they were not even in countries like the United States. I think we have made progress fairly and evenly. And the coming of women into the judicial echelons means that women's cases are given more sympathetic hearing. There's a gender empathy, and the women who come to the court feel that at least they can be understood, which sometimes would be a difficulty when they were just male judges who would really prioritize the cases which they thought were important, like corporate matters or matters concerning services. But half the population being female, it's very important that their problems be given as much consideration as the other problems do arise. But if you want to ask any questions, which I may be able to answer, as I was mentioning, I have been primarily a law teacher. And even now I teach law in 2 different law colleges. And I try to inculcate into the students the spirit of equanimity, non-discriminatoriness, a gender balance, and the fact that they must administer justice with patience, tolerance, and even-handed scales. And I deliberately do not practice even in the Supreme Court, because now most of the judges in the Supreme Court happen to be my previous students. And I would find it a little bit embarrassing that they would have to be confronted by me, and I'm not really up to preparing or presenting my brief in a manner that I could when I was much younger. So I think it's best that everyone should stay in their own place. And that's one of the things I think that the judiciary tries to inculcate in the public, to keep within the realm that is subscribed to them by the Constitution of Pakistan, which of course, I don't think it's a very straitjacket constitution, and it's not difficult to amend. But it's for the judiciary to see that whatever amendments take place, or whatever there is governance which is not according to the Constitution, it can be remedied by the courts, and anyone can approach the court at any time for remedy.
Justice Iqbal, thank you very much indeed. And I was heartwarmed to hear of the values that you inculcate in your students as a teacher. I think that this is vital. So thank you very much indeed for emphasizing that. I appreciate that you're now a law professor rather than a practicing judge, but from your perspective and from your contacts that still exist across the judiciary, what is your perspective of the extent to which that the judiciary is able to work independently in this situation of extreme polarization? I appreciate that you would be speaking as an external observer, but still somebody who is working in the sphere of law.
I would still think that the judges would not allow themselves to be influenced by either the lawmakers or by the administration. And it's actually the political governments who really like to believe in the word rule. I think the word rule should not exist in the dictionary, because people who are elected in the democratic framework are meant to govern. And govern means to do what they have the mandate to do according to whatever was their manifesto. But if they choose to rule, then it is for the judiciary to ensure that whatever is being done within the limits that the law prescribes, and that they act according to settled frameworks. Unfortunately, we have not been able to, over these 75 years, develop infrastructures into all our systems of governance or the administration. And for that reason, sometimes the judiciary may be able to guide and advise as to how and when this can be done. And there are separate administrative tribunals which look after the administrative excesses, but everyone can come to the Supreme Court for the remedy. And that is actually the final court. And I do think that they are proper arbiters of justice. And I like to think that because most of them are my students or ex-students.
Of course. And just picking up what Professor Wasim has written about elsewhere, of the historic context of a bureaucratic polity that emphasized the rule of law rather than necessarily the rule of public representatives, I'm picking up very much your emphasis on the implementation of law as it exists, rather than necessarily acting as, should we say, a political regulator through the independence of the judiciary. If I may now pass to our fourth speaker, Ms. Saha Bandial, we very much would welcome your expert comments on the question of democratic participation of women in Pakistan politics. Justice Iqbal has made reference to the improvements in terms of women's representation across law, but also a more sympathetic treatment for women's cases before law. But in the democratic realm more generally, what is your perspective and analysis?
Thank you, Dr. Onslow, for having me here. Pakistan at 75, we must also remember, is a country which ranks second from bottom on the gender parity index. There is a crisis related to women in our country. About 12 million girls are out of school. About 18%, over 18% of girls are married off before the age of 18. Very few women have access to reproductive health. We have one of the highest maternal mortality ratios in the world. Also, violence against women is endemic. There are stories of honor killing, domestic violence that we read every day in the newspaper. So there is a women's crisis in Pakistan at 75. Now, the question is, how are women in politics dealing with these issues? Has the presence of women in politics made a difference? Now, it's interesting to note that we saw women in greater numbers enter politics after the rule or during the regime of General Pervez Musharraf, when a 33% quota was set in place in all local government bodies across all three tiers of local government. And then thereafter in 2002, when the constitution was amended to give about 17% reserved seats to women in all representative assemblies, which means the National Assembly, the Senate, and also the provincial assemblies. Now, we have about, I think, before the PTI legislators resigned earlier this year, we had about 69 women in the National Assembly, about 60 elected on general seat, on reserve seats, and about 9 on general seats. A criticism that's leveled against many of these women who come on the reserve seats is that they're mere rubber stamps, that they just sort of acquiesce or agree on to the policies enacted by their political parties or by their male colleagues. But this criticism is largely unfair, because if you look at the legislative business in which female legislators are involved, it is commendable. And you have female legislators who've been involved in politics for a long period of time. They comment that the larger number of women in these assemblies has meant that the environment and discourse in representative bodies, in elected bodies, has changed. And a new set of priorities have been brought in. You see there are sort of studies which record that around 25% of the private member bills in the National Assembly are introduced by women, either individually or as collectives. And the subject matter on which these bills are introduced is quite varied. So it refers to sort of national security, human rights, rights of people with disabilities, rape law reform, law regarding honor killing, the rights of healthcare workers, etc., drug abuse, human trafficking. So a lot of laws related to human rights, to issues that also affect women personally, have been brought in through the representation of women in formal politics. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's a critique that's leveled by various female politicians themselves, and that is that many of these women are denied real decision-making power. So even currently in our cabinet of about, I would say, maybe possibly 40 federal and state ministers, we have about 5 or 6 women, not a very large number. Also, a lot of decision-making power or decision-making positions in political parties are not those given to women. Mm-hmm. So the criticism often is that even if we have this representation in these assemblies, real decision-making power is not given to women, despite their great performance as legislators. But let's look also at the bottom-up approach. What is the role of the female electorate in Pakistan? Is that an important sort of constituency that the political parties are targeting or not? We actually see that there's a huge gender gap between the number of male voters registered and female voters registered, about approximately 12 million. And the Election Commission of Pakistan has recently taken a lot of initiative to sort of register more women. But in the recent elections by polls that happened in October, which is last month, there's a report in the newspaper that came yesterday, actually, about in 75 polling stations, there was less than 10% female voter turnout. So even if we have a large number of female voters registered, even if there is initiative being taken to bring more women on the electoral roll, many women are not stepping out. And oftentimes that's on account of the kind of gatekeeping that is being undertaken within homes, where independent political decisions are not being allowed. Women are not being allowed to make those independent political decisions because men are often gatekeepers of their vote. Can they vote or can they not vote? And if they vote, who will they vote for? There was actually a study I was reading where in a survey conducted, about 56% of those who responded said that they thought it was not inappropriate to stop a woman from voting if she would vote against what the household had decided. So that's quite interesting for me because top bottom, through legislative change, through constitutional change, we have brought in a significant number of women. But from bottom up, maybe the female electorate doesn't have that independent voting power that we would want it to have, that it should have, if it is to be a viable sort of voting bank for very many political parties, for political parties who will actually engage in and reflect on and take action on issues that are important to women. Now, let's look at how women are participating on democratizing the society outside the formal political institutions. And I think this is something which has in the past few years become very significant. And it's taken the form largely of protest politics. We have seen the phenomenon of the Aurat March take shape since 2018, the last 4 or 5 years. The Aurat March is a demonstration that's undertaken on International Women's Day. It's organized by a collective of women coming from different groups, social stratas also, demonstration that involves men sometimes as well, not in the numbers we would want them to be involved in, but a large number of women. And the sort of modus operandi or the strategy of the Aurat marches, as we call it, is to take the state head on in demanding their rights, demanding their civil liberties, their human rights, also categorically and very vociferously challenging entrenched patriarchal norms and practices. We saw over the last few years provocative placards being held by women who walked through the streets of Lahore, Karachi, Hyderabad, Faisalabad, in many big cities in Pakistan. And these provocative messages even challenged sort of the division of labor within the home, challenged questions of how women should dress or sit, challenged how divorced women are looked at in society. So it was also, the Aurat March challenge is also to the personal space within which women operate, and how, and it's important to note this, how the personal then translates into their engagement with the public. And I think this is a very important movement that has taken shape, because women are also reclaiming public spaces through such protest politics. And the public sphere generally in our society is considered unsafe for women. It's a space where women should not venture. So this protest politics also challenges this dichotomy between the public and the private, and what is a permissible space for women to step into and what is not. And the Aurat March, I would say, also is important because it drew linkages with the formal political arena as well. Because when there was backlash from various quarters, there was backlash from religious quarters, there was backlash in this year from sitting ministers of the government, and then sort of, the police administration, civil administration was not being cooperative in permitting women to march on International Women's Day. The court had to intervene. So there were all these interconnections being made with the courts, with politicians who were asked to support them in being able to march on. So it's interesting to see how this sort of organization outside of formal politics also drew linkages with the state structures.
So thank you very much indeed for that summary of the extent of the ways in which the women are using, public space outside formal structures to pursue their rights and their agendas and to address their needs. Thank you very much. If I could put a follow-on question, please, to Mr. Sethi. You made reference to the explosive platform of social media. I would be grateful if you could summarize where you see the media and its politicization in the current fraught circumstances.
Yes, thanks, Sue. Well, the media is in the crossfire. media people are openly taking political sides, and pretty strong sides. And there's a lot of young media practitioners who were close to the military establishment, especially when Imran Khan himself was close to the military establishment, and who are now caught in this dilemma that the military establishment and Imran Khan are at odds. And most of them have decided to go over to Imran Khan's side, which means that they're estranged from from the military establishment that they were once very close to. Used to flog the establishment narrative on most occasions. So that's one side. And then there are the others who had a rough time under Imran Khan. Many of them had to were ousted from the TV channels that they used to work for because there was constant pressure from both the military establishment and Imran Khan to oust them because they were more independent and critical of both. And so therefore they ended up going to the social media to air their views, especially on YouTube, vlogs and so on and so forth. So now the tables seem to be turned because the military establishment has suddenly become neutral or apolitical. And these very journalists who were once at the periphery or kicked out into the periphery are now being moved back into mainstream channels. So that's what's happening. On the other side, those who were with Imran Khan and with the military establishment now feel threatened. Several have had cases, trumped up cases built against them. And they've thought it better to leave the country. There are at least 3 or 4 who have fled because they fear persecution, because they're not ready to abandon their anti-establishment views now. So you have a very curious situation in which the media remains polarized and the boot is on the other foot, as it were. And then there's social media. I mean, social media is a freewheeling platform, which is actually dominated by trolling, which is organized and not terribly independent. The Imran Khan was the first one, and his party was the first one to realize the enormous publicity or propaganda value of social media, and was able to organize armies of trolls to carry out his propaganda, which brought forth the label of being the modern Goebbels from the other side, as it were. And the other established parties are traditional parties who've still not been able to master the art of propaganda on social media and are therefore lagging in that respect. So in one sense, social media is controlled, or shall we say dominated, by people who are pro-Imran Khan and the PTI, and have now obviously become anti-establishment as well. Not so long ago, there were the troll armies of both Imran Khan and the establishment. So we have this very curious situation that in the mainstream media is not really laying down the agenda. The agenda is being laid down by social media. The topics are being laid down by social media. Social media is dominated by Imran Khan's supporters. Some of them organized, others out of passionate belief in Imran Khan. And so we have a pretty one-sided situation, which is all, shall we say, weighted in favor of Imran Khan. And so some people like us end up trending for all the wrong reasons, because the social troll armies don't like what we have to say. And this is a cause of insecurity and concern. There are many of us who are now who have been out in the cold and are trying to make our way back into mainstream media. But we are constantly faced with issues. I'll give you one example. Today, I gave an interview to a prominent Indian channel in which I said more or less the same things that I'm saying here. And immediately the attack has come that I'm pandering to the Indian media by talking about Pakistan's crisis. Why? Because obviously I'm saying it as it is. And that's not what the troll armies want to hear. I dare say if I say more or less the same sort of things, the same allegation will be made. So of course that this isn't an Indian channel, so I'll be spared the lack of patriotism on my part. But so, it is difficult out there for all sides. The people who are pro-Imran Khan are now feeling the heat from both the establishment and the sitting government. And the people who are now trying to find their way back into mainstream have suffered for 4 years and more, and are concerned that if the situation deteriorates and there's less democratic space, where will we go? So it's not a good or a healthy situation in Pakistan regarding the media.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Wasim, if I may ask you, you made reference to Imran Khan's support base being the middle class as the rival of the political class. Can you elaborate, please, a little on your understanding of the fractured natures? As you say, you made reference to the mosaic mix, but it seems to be an extraordinary coalescence, but it is still multidimensional. Neither side is homogenous. No, there are multiple interests and outlooks which are playing out across these classes, as you identify.
Middle class has been difficult to define anyway. Whereas, as you know, industrial class, laboring class, landlord class, peasant, much easier to define. But lately, of course, there is quite a bit of literature which has come out on the middle class. So what is it? In Pakistan's case, what I see is that the middle class has been the catchment area for the two institutions, that is the army and the civil bureaucracy. Army used to be recruited from the rural area, particularly the officer cadre, but the trend has shifted, and now it's increasingly from the urban areas that the army officer cadre emerges. Now, those who are inside the state, that is the two state apparatuses, and those outside, for example, in various professions like journalists, professors, chartered accountants, engineers, doctors, others, they have developed a vision whereby politics is all dirty, it's bad, it's not good. Politicians are elected by people who are illiterate, superstitious, ignorant, but of course, very innocent. So they must be led from outside the political class, and that has been the dilemma. 4 coup d'etats took place in Pakistan. They had a kind of a constituency in the middle class. In other words, middle class hated what has been going on in the name of electoral politics. On the other hand, the middle class has a near monopoly over higher education. And of course, it's their children, their daughters and sons who have been going to the universities and to various professions, and their family structure is relatively more democratic. In other words, the middle class is socially progressive, politically conservative. It wants to close the doors of the state on the masses because therein it sees corrupt politicians coming to power. All the policy, for example, is still under any elected government made by the bureaucrats, by the military officers. So policy evades the elected politicians, and that has been the pattern for the last several decades. So there is this kind of division where the middle class is, in a way, modern in some sense, but there are two ideological positions which are often taken by the middle class. First, religious, and second, nationalist. In these two domains, we see middle class being very, very active, and they are the real and ultimate policymakers in Pakistan.
Thank you. If you could just give us an understanding of the demography of this, that Ms. Banjal made reference to obviously that, you know, the role of women in politics at the grassroots level, but in terms of the numerical size of the middle class compared to the political class, I'm just trying to think of the potential constituencies which are being drawn into this fraught political space.
Again, it has been very difficult to gauge the power, particularly the numbers of the middle class. Of course, I came across various studies. PIDE, for example, Pakistan Institute of Development Studies in Pakistan, there the scholar has given a number like 31%. Shah Javed Barki talked about 1/3 of the nation being middle class. And there are certain others who feel that the overall standard of living has gone up. People have moved from villages to cities, and they have occupied more and more jobs and developed a kind of morality, a kind of an ideological matrix, which is middle class, even though they may or may not have the income to support that particular framework of mind. So I would stick to that. There is somewhere, including, of course, the lower middle class, which is more religious than the middle class. So together, they would be slightly more than 1/3 in Pakistan.
No, thank you very much. Ms. Banjal, if I could move to you, because I know Justice Iqbal has just moved. I wondered if you could comment about youth and their involvement in grassroots movements to further their interests, their rights as citizens and subjects, or rather as citizens. Do you see the same level of mobilization and engagement, or is it primarily gendered in your experience?
I think one of the successes of the PTI is that it has been able to tap the sort of power of the youth across genders, rather. And I think this is where the other established dynastic parties, political parties, failed. But the sort of the power of Imran Khan and his ability also to sort of dominate social media stems from the support base from the youth, men and women. So I would say that there is an increasing inclination to get involved in politics amongst the youth of Pakistan. And it's not necessarily gendered at all when it comes to sort of association with political parties. Also, there have been movements with respect to sort of the rights of labor, which have also been led by youth in Pakistan. So they are getting increasingly involved.
Thank you very much indeed. Justice Iqbal, if I may ask you, please, in your experience, although you've outlined the advances that have been made by women in the higher realms of the justice system, which is laudable, but in your perspective, do you believe that the judiciary has become gradually more socially, morally, and religiously conservative in recent decades, or is this a flawed characterization of what you have observed?
It's very unfortunate that the law of contempt is not brought into practice very often here, because whichever party feels that a decision has gone against them by the higher judiciary will come out with all kinds of allegations, sometimes saying they are too conservative, sometimes saying they are biased. And the other party will do the same. Now, you see, our system is an adversarial system. One party has to lose, the other party has to win. And unfortunately, the present situation is that there's so much intolerance in all parts of society that they will invariably come out with blaming everything on the judicature, because saying that the judgment was not balanced, it was biased. The court was conservative or the court was too liberal, one thing or another. To my experience, I think the courts are playing their role to their optimum ability and in a very proper and unbiased manner as they could, given the circumstances they are confronted with. And I wish that the other two branches of government and the third, which now is the media, should appreciate this role and give credit to the judiciary where it is due. I think the judiciary is doing as well as they could under very trying circumstances.
Thank you very much indeed for what you pointed to, is that there is an important trust deficit in public institutions, and if the judiciary is really at the forefront because of the question of litigation or in terms of implementation of law, that then these will be the encounters with the state that people are more likely to have in their everyday lives. If I now may move to Dr. Kiran Hassan, who is going to moderate the questions for us. Kiran, if you could please summarize the questions and say to whom they should be addressed.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank an exceptional panel, and the discussion that we've had today has been is strongly appreciated. First of all, shall I just, Sue, can I ask a question as a personal question?
Of course.
I had been wanting to ask, this is for Najam. Najam, what do you think is going to be, is the new army chief going to have, what is his approach going to be towards PTI and Imran Khan if the political crisis continues?
I would imagine that the institution as a whole has taken a decision, which is what the Director General of the ISI recently said on camera, in public, that they want to stay away from meddling in political affairs. They've, I think, realized that they burnt their hands this time around rather badly. And they've been abused blue and black for it. Now they're in no man's land. They don't want to continue propping up and supporting Imran Khan because he's the one who brought them into disrepute in the first place. But they're not ready to also support the other side, because the propaganda against the other side is quite vociferous, that they're thugs, that they're thieves, that they're dynastics, they've ruled this country for 30 years, and what have they given the people of this country, and so on and so forth. Pretty virulent propaganda, and I might say a propaganda in which the institutions have played their due role in propagating this. So now it's a bit difficult for them to start taking sides again. So I would imagine that whoever is the new army chief is going to try and stay away from direct meddling in the affairs, which is to say he's not going to be anti-Imran. He's not going to be pro the Sharifs. I think he will want to, what he would like to see would be a stable government, parliament, a functioning parliament, an independent judiciary, and so on. But that's a wish list. Given the sort of situation we have, and the fact that politicians still continue to run to the army chief and beg him to take their side and prop them up, it's going to be a hard task. But I think there is an institutional decision that we want to stay away from it as much as possible. So whoever wins the next election, first of all, I think it'll be a free and fair election. I think this time there will be no meddling. Last time around in 2018, the track record shows that the establishment really pulled out all the stops to get Imran to win. But this time they're not going to help anyone. And they're going to let the chips fall where they may. I think their best bet would be, from their point of view, that if there's a hung parliament, which means that no party gets a 2/3 majority, or even if one party gets a majority, that party is constantly on the edge and looking for allies and friends. And so therefore, a coalition government would probably suit the armed forces better. They will get all their demands accepted, and they will not have to prop it up, because if the coalition is strong enough, then it's amongst the coalition partners how they end up wielding power and how they end up distributing the spoils of office and perks and privileges. I can't imagine a new army chief taking sides, nor do I imagine that he will get directly involved in politics. But having said that, this is an interesting country. Things change rapidly. One crisis comes on top of the other. And every time there's a serious crisis, there's a debate about how the country can be bailed out, what is the national interest, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be a tricky ride.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sethi. Kiran, while you're looking at the next list of questions, if I could put a question to Professor Wasim, the way that Mr. Sethi was talking presented the army as a homogeneous and a solid institution. Would you identify it as being more fractured, Or do you think that, in fact, that there is a coalescence of the army as a pillar of the state, certainly, but a concerted desire to retreat into a more neutral position and not to be the arbiter of politics?
Sorry, Sue, if I may just cut in before Dr. Sub speaks. I did not say that, nor did I imply
I apologize.
that. I was never asked that question, so I've tried to.
I'm sorry. I apologize, sir. I don't wish to put words into your mouth. It's just the way
there are differences. There are differences
of course there are.
There are support groups, and there are all sorts of, shall we say, tilts and balances right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, thank you very much, Professor Wasim. Would you like to elaborate on that particular point?
First of all, it seems that you are very well acquainted with whatever is going on in Pakistan and whatever the media is talking about, which was that there is division in the army.
Mm-hmm.
This was talked about quite a bit, particularly because the Imranites have been, in a way, giving an impression that we have our lobby in the army, and some of the retired army officers have been active on some fronts. Having said that, the point is that the attitude towards the political class has gone so deep, the negative attitude, the middle class attitude, which of course has been internalized to a great extent by the two or rather three state apparatuses of army, bureaucracy, and judiciary. So one can, in a way, cautiously claim that yes, there is an impression that there is a kind of an opinion in the army which is not as solidly united as it used to be, because there is an Imran constituency. On the other hand, the army action would be united. There is a power structure within the army which is solid as before, and we cannot expect from the army any kind of divided house taking decisions, for example, in favor of one politician or the other. That remains the ultimate situation in Pakistan.
No, thank you very much, Professor Wasim. And I apologize, Mr. Sethi, for misrepresenting your remarks. I do apologize. Kiran, if you would like to
yes,
please.
Thank you so much. We've got a whole range of questions and interesting comments, and I'm going to now start offering the questions to various speakers. There's one by Syed Badrul Ahsan, and he says, do Pakistanis believe that the army will be at some point take a backseat and unfettered democracy will become a reality? Now, we've already discussed the first part of the question, but unfettered democracy will become a reality. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Can I?
Please do, Professor Wasim.
Okay. First of all, no. Unfettered democracy in Pakistan, unfortunately, is a dream, at least in the foreseeable future, because the establishment has deeply dug in the power structure, particularly in the matter of policy making, and overall the weakness of the political parties as actors, that is obvious to almost everybody, every observer of Pakistan's politics. So in my research, which has recently come out in the form of a book, there I've used the word establishmentarian democracy. So here, there is no going back to military rule, because political mobilization has gone too far and people are too much into the political game. Therefore, the present status quo will remain, where key areas of policy making will remain in the hands of the establishment, while electoral democracy will also remain very much in operation.
Thank you. There's a whole range of questions. I'm going to put this question to Justice Nasra Iqbal. It's by Professor Catherine Adney, and she says, if the long march fails and doesn't lead to new elections, can Imran Khan step back?
Well, that is a very loaded political question, and I think the judiciary is the least dangerous branch of governance, and it would not intermeddle with the situation if the elections come about mutually negotiated between the party which is presently in power and the pressure that is being created by the fact that large number of people are supporting Imran Khan, and the negotiated elections do take place. It's the duty of the Election Commission to ensure that they are free and fair, and it's the duty of the army to stay clear. One thing I would very strongly want to happen, which so far has not happened, is that we do not have the doctrine of legitimate expectancy in the army as we have in the judiciary for the past several years, which means that whoever is the next in command, in the chain of command, would automatically come to be the leader of the chief of army staff, or whichever part of the armed forces that he or she is leading. And that could resolve all these disputes of everyone trying to create an influence amongst the army infrastructure, because democracy needs to flourish on its own without any interference by the army, who is meant to guard our frontiers and not to intervene in internal politics, which is the same which I feel about the judiciary. And the judiciary so far has acted as the least dangerous direction, even though there was a lot of pressure on them and all kinds of contemptuous statements. But I'm very happy to see that they do not follow the pressures that are created on them. And I hope that this situation lasts, because that is the last thing that we need, is a judiciary which is biased.
Thank you very much indeed, Justice. So an argument for legitimacy.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and the same question, if just a kind of quick comment by all panelists, basically, if Imran Khan, if the long march fails, will Imran Khan step back? Najam,
What
Sahar,
do you mean step back?
This is Professor Catherine Adney's question. If the long march fails, doesn't lead to a new elections, can Imran Khan step back? Do you think he will just...
The thing is, Imran is not somebody who steps back. He does step back and then move forward again. So his whole approach has been to fight and to talk at the same time. But he talks only when he's not winning the fight. So I suspect that like he didn't give up when his long march in 2014 failed, he will continue to hammer away and he will continue to knock at the door. The problem is, how effective will he be? Will he be able to launch another long march a month or 2 months down the line and again try and destabilize the government, and so on and so forth? So there is a case to be made out for saying that if Imran doesn't win this round, he will not give up. He will continue to whip up a storm and try and continue destabilization politics until the government, there is a weak moment and the government collapses. The other side of the argument is that if this moment passes, it's not the easiest thing in the world to mount long marches every second day. Already there is an argument to be made that his supporters are thinning out. He's been on the trail for over a couple of months now. Indefatigable energy. He's been holding meetings and public rallies almost every day and thundering away. He hasn't given up. I mean, he's keeping the pressure on. But as I said, this is a bit of a climax. If and when this moment passes, there is a likelihood that he will have to go back to the drawing board again and take it from there. Then much will depend not just on his own forces or the enthusiasm of his supporters, but it will also depend on how the government of the day, which is the Democratic, the PDM, the 9-party alliance, whether they are able to give some relief to the people of this country. If they continue to impose hardship policies on them, the ground for Imran Khan's rebellion and revolt will remain fertile. But if, on the other hand, the economy begins to pick up, inflation comes down, and the government is able to stabilize everything. And by the way, right now, the indications are that if this moment passes, the various financial institutions, global institutions, and various other donor countries will come in to bail Pakistan out. They're already making commitments. They're looking for stabilization and certainty. And if this government is able to do that, then this government might well be able to survive the next few months before another crisis hits it at budget time. So really, it's going to be an open-ended game for many months now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sethi. Ms. Bandial, if I could come to you, please. What is your perspective from your expertise on the likelihood of how this moment is going to play out? Do you see that Imran Khan will continue because able to draw upon social discontent and social bereavement of people's sense of marginalization and suffering?
Dr. Onzo, sorry, I missed a bit of what you said. I was having internet issues.
That's quite all right. I was wondering about your particular perspective from the viewpoint of women and youth, whether you see a likelihood of continued support for Imran Khan, irrespective of whether or not the issue of fresh elections, the future of the head of the army has been decided. Do you think that these drivers, these dynamic forces will continue to support him, or it depends very much more on the economic and social situation?
I think if last month's elections are to be any indication, we would see that there is significant support for Imran Khan across the board. He won the majority of the seats he contested in the National Assembly. So I think the support is very much there. And the sort of economic issues that are plaguing the country right now, that are affecting the country right now, are sort of giving greater impetus to that support. And as Dr. Wasim was commenting, I think the youth generally and the middle class particularly also have this sense of distrust against the PPP and the PMLN, and therefore the PTI ends up being the sort of the best amongst all evils. So I think the support will pretty much continue in my viewpoint.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Wasim, your viewpoint?
Well, at the moment, the establishment, the PTI, and the government, all three of them are trying to reach some kind of understanding. The Long March, for example, this is the 6th or 7th or 8th Long March. Long marches didn't succeed till now to change the government or to win over the strategic stakeholders to the side of Imran Khan. As the time passes, the fear is on both sides, Imran will lose its power, street power, because people get tired, and the demonstrations seem to be useless as the time goes on. And then for the government, probably it will buy time to improve its governance. There are various efforts to amend relations with foreign powers, and probably the focus is on the economic crisis. So there is that way some hope. And the army doesn't want to be more visible than it is or has been during the last 1 or 2 years. So I think there is a kind of a status quo. And if elections happen to be there somewhere between March and October next year, maybe all the three sides agree to it and wait it out.
Thank you very much. Kieran, could you, the next question, please? I'm sorry.
Yes, the next question is by Antoine Levick from the IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies. And this question is to all speakers. He says, my question to all panelists follows Dr. Sethi's point on that the hybrid regime is no more, echoed by Mr. Wasim's sense that there is only a damage control strategy in place. If so, What is the likely way forward? Where does this situation leave Pakistan's decade-old plus return to competitive electoral politics?
Mr. Sethi, please.
Oh, okay. Good question. I'm afraid a lot of things are up in the air. There is no model. There is only one model, and that is that parliamentary democracy and constitutional democracy have to work. In a country where now there's so much polarization and so many grievances amongst the various stakeholders. Therefore, much will depend on the leaders of these mainstream political parties. If they are not able to put their act together and get parliament to become functional and the politics of live and let live, then I suspect two things will happen. First of all, there will be a slide into criminality and anarchy across the country. And the second thing is, I think the religious parties, especially those that are now knocking on the doors of the electoral politics, like the TLP, etc., will continue to become stronger electorally. So it is not inconceivable that if these political parties are not able to get their act together and live and let live and have a charter of democracy and constitutionalism, then the net benefit will go not to the military or to any nationalist force, but to religious parties. And that is something we've seen earlier. I'll give you one example. Karachi used to be a party where the religious parties, the mainstream religious parties, used to predominate many, at least 3 decades ago. And then the focus shifted to the MQM that took over that particular vote bank. And now we see an interesting development. The MQM is on the losing side. The People's Party is not winning in the urban areas as much as it should. The PMLN is not on the scene. So the contest now has gone back, in a sense, to the religious parties and the PTI. And if the PTI is not going to be given a clean election, and other parties are going to gang up against it in, say, a place like Karachi, then my sense is the religious parties will make a comeback in a place like Karachi.
Thank you very much. Professor Wasim.
I see that we are moving towards some kind of elections, but there is no hurry on the part of anybody other than Imran Khan. Imran Khan's calculation is that this is the time that he can win the elections. His argument seems to be that he is able to whip up the public sentiment. Now, that is where the whole issue lies. The electoral dynamics works in a way where the street power is a relatively poor indicator of the constituency politics. The street power belongs to cities. And secondly, it belongs to those areas, those cities and towns from where people are brought to the capital cities. This has been the pattern. In other words, they don't reflect the local dynamics of the constituency where caste, biradri, class, and dynasty that matters. So when they go to the elections, and particularly in the case of Imran Khan, when he goes to the local constituency without the support of the establishment, which happened last time, then probably this popularity can be traced to its urban and youth origins. In other words, we have to have some kind of stronger indicators. The social media, which is predominantly impacting the pro-Imran opinion, gives a clear impression that Imran has a constituency which is able to win. But there lies the point. He is not or was not confident, for example, last time when he stood for elections from multiple constituencies, in fact, 6. In other words, you have to have on your side electables. Last time, electables were brought for him and to his side. This time, there is no machinery, no stakeholder powerful enough to bring the electables to Imran's side. So there'll be a kind of a balancing out, and there the local dynamics will take over, and that would mean the word is used often, the dynasts. So the local dynasts, the political families, particularly in Sindh and Punjab, they take over. And there, if the army is not particularly in favor of one or the other, then obviously there'll be a kind of a hung parliament. But there again, one has to think about it carefully. Does army want Imran Khan back? This time, probably not, because in government, they didn't like him. Out of the government, he's a nuisance out there in the street, because army doesn't want a destabilizer par excellence there. So this is a kind of a black hole which we have to discern very carefully.
Thank you very much. Kieran, if you could have one more round of questions, please. We've got 7 more minutes.
Thank you. I've just got one question for both Justice Iqbal and Sahar, and it's sorry, I'm just, where is it? Yes, so the question is, because both of them have legal backgrounds, a very significant differentiation between rule and govern for Justice Iqbal. What needs to be improved to bring about qualitative changes in the democratic environment? I mean, you mentioned the differentiation between rule and govern, and this question is by Rahnuma. And if Sahar, you can also actually, expand on this question, that would be fantastic.
Okay, Justice Iqbal first. I hope the sound quality on the call is.
I hope so too. It's very unfortunate that anyone who comes into power in Pakistan comes with this speculative view that they have to rule. And I have heard some political party leaders say these parties or these people were born to rule. The concept of dynasty is very strongly there, and we have to somehow eradicate it from our system of governance. That is the only way that we would have good governance according to the manifestos of the parties who try to come into power on a basis of democratic elections. But when that comes about, it's a utopian wish of mine personally, that is how democracy is supposed to operate in a country which is built on the principles of a democracy and the rule of law. And the rule of law definitely does not have any place for rulership. It only will want good governance. And I hope that Sarah and the others would also be able to cast some light on this.
Thank you very much. And Sahar, your view, please, of that question.
Thank you. I agree with Justice Iqbal entirely that when the political parties who are to represent us eventually in politics are themselves based on dynasties, and there's an somewhat lack of democracy within the sort of power structures that are built within the political party, then how does it translate into practice? There needs to be sort of possible regulation of political parties, and there have been several sort of suggestions in this regard made by various commenters that regulate political parties, regulate how sort of leadership positions within political parties are assigned, are allocated, have a particular quota to ensure that the actual diversity within the leadership positions within political parties, and that may lead to a more diverse and democratic and representative political party then that will go on to represent us in parliament and to govern as opposed to rule, to actually be justified in sort of having the positions of power that they eventually do in representative bodies. So I think there needs to be some legislative regulation of how political parties are functioning within.
Thank you very much indeed. Colleagues, if I could just put one more question, please. The point has been made about Pakistan's position in the wider region and the country's foreign policy. To what extent do you think that the foreign policy is relevant and impinges upon the current constitutional crisis inside Pakistan?
Who's this addressed to?
Colleagues, to all of you.
All of you.
The extent to which you think outside factors, outside actors, outside agency is part of this, the explosive mix, the tinderbox that I made reference to.
Well, it has never been a major factor in the past, but it now is, because Imran is using this to his advantage. We know there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Pakistan. Actually, there is in much of the world. So Imran is using that, and that rhetoric is falling on ears that are receptive. So yes, I mean, the whole notion of regime change in Pakistan attributed to the Americans. But it's interesting that there's a statement from the Americans today that their partnership or their relationship with America is not dependent on what is currently going on in Pakistan. So that it's a way of saying that we will work with whoever is in government, and that of course the relationship with the army is a very enduring relationship. General Bajwa has had productive visits to both Saudi Arabia and to Washington recently, and to the UK. So I think as far as the foreign international community is concerned, they will work with whoever is in office. Their experience with Imran Khan hasn't been good. Imran's arrogance and has stood in the way of good diplomatic relations. And but I suspect that if he's in power again, he will be more circumspect and perhaps may have learned some lessons during this time. So my sense is we will continue to remain engaged with the international community. The question really for us will be whether or not we slip into the Chinese-Russian camp as opposed to the American camp, which is where the pressure is now coming from, that we ought to take sides, and we're trying to resist that, because our aid and trade is with the Western world, and not with China and the Russia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sethi. Professor Wasim.
Well, I have mentioned in my book the term alternative globality. In Pakistan, often we become less than realist about foreign policy goals. We have been shying away from playing regional politics, and we have been, in a way, oriented either to the Islamic world or to the West in general, from wherever we can get help for the ongoing crisis to be resolved. Within the region, unfortunately, we don't have much of success. So with India, with Afghanistan.
I apologize. Thank you very much. I apologize, Professor Wasim. There was a noise off. If I may ask you to continue, please.
Yeah, of course. So nearer home, we should play the goal of a successful foreign policy, which we don't. We look beyond the region, and as I mentioned, this is a region without regionalism, and that means that we, for example, increase our insecurity, which costs us by way of the defense budget, for example, or we have to buy things from farther away, and therefore we again pay for it. And again, in Afghanistan, for example, we pursued foreign policy, which was always a mixture of dreams and the reality, in a way, in pursuit of what has been sometimes discarded and at other times owned, which is strategic depth. This doctrine has been hanging around our neck, and so on. So probably foreign policy is far more realistic than is considered in a dispassionate way by the policymakers in Pakistan.
Thank you very much indeed. So with that, I'm going to thank our panelists sincerely for giving us the benefit of their expertise, their insightful views of the complicated historic and contemporary dynamics that is as has been said, the multiple crises in Pakistan today. In addition to the crises that you identified, Mr. Sethi, Ms. Bandial identified a women's crisis that Professor Wasim, you have pointed to the likely endurance of establishmentarian democracy at best, but the problematic aspects of dynamic dynastic democracy embedded with this, which complicates effective good governance and rule of law inside the country. Thank you for giving us your estimations of how the current crisis is likely to roll out, but as well as identifying where the potential flashpoints and danger points are. Thank you too for pointing to the importance of the economic crisis, which we haven't really explored, but the extent to which that external donors, be they multilateral, bilateral, or governments, are looking for political stability inside the country with a view to investing and also to extending more generous donor packages, in addition to the role of the World Bank and the IMF. And in fact, I have read, of course, that Imran Khan is being encouraged to sit down with the current government to address the problems that are still so besetting Pakistanis affected by those monumental floods and the humanitarian disasters and the ongoing crisis which confronts them in terms of the destruction of their livelihood and their vulnerabilities and the very real health issues and the point of infrastructure and economic rebuilding that is required from this. So, colleagues, my sincere thanks to all of you.